Continuing with my Castles of Shakespeare series, this month we're talking about the Shakespeare history of Bristol Castle. In Shakespeare's play Richard II, the character named Green, who is a servant of King Richard II, says, "Well, I will for refuge straight to Bristol Castle. The Earl of Wiltshire is already there." In the very next scene, Bristol Castle is named again when Henry IV declares, "But we must win your grace to go with us to Bristol Castle, which they say is held by Bushy, Bagot, and other accomplices, the caterpillars of the Commonwealth, which I have sworn to weed and pluck away." Bristol Castle was built in a highly strategic position on the eastern side of a walled town. So there's two rivers. There's the River Avon to the south and the River From to the north. Now, there are lots of River Avons in England, and I will link you to some episodes that help with that. But this is not Stratford-upon-Avon, okay? This is a different River Avon. Here, this map should help. These two rivers were linked by a man-made channel, and that channel creates a moat around Bristol Castle. Now, because the two rivers sat at different water levels, the barrier or water-controlled structure was built on the northern side to hold back and regulate the flow of water. This helped the moat around Bristol Castle function properly. The town of Bristol itself had already been built here where these two rivers meet, and once the castle moat was added, both the town and the castle were completely surrounded by water, and that makes this location extremely easy to defend, right? Because you've got water barriers happening. Now, the castle was very active in the years leading up to the 16th century, and there was a variety of structural changes. Depending on who was in charge at Bristol Castle over the centuries, different people added different features that they wanted to see, from adding on buildings to changing the design, and then even adding like several towers were added to make it more Renaissance look, okay? And by the 16th century, the castle itself was largely abandoned and left in disrepair. It was there, but nobody was really using it for anything. And the city authorities didn't have any control over Bristol Castle because it was still technically a royal property. So this area became a refuge for lawbreakers. Having that reputation of being this haven for lawless people makes the statement from Shakespeare's play a little bit funny. When you think about King Richard's servant seeking refuge at Bristol Castle, that word refuge specifically would have been tied to Bristol Castle for Shakespeare's audience for a completely different reason. They would have seen it as people who break the law can go to Bristol Castle and be untouchable. So you can run with that if you like. But Shakespeare is including Bristol in his story of Richard II because the actual Bristol Castle played a key role in the War of the Roses for the Plantagenets. A short but interesting sort of side note backstory here before the War of the Roses is that when Henry II died, Richard I, which you will remember as Richard the Lionhearted, becomes king. Now, Richard's younger brother, John, is really mad about Richard being king, and he's trying to overthrow this at every place he can. Now, he wants the throne for himself, so he waits until Richard is held captive in Germany to raise a coup. During the coup, there were those who remained loyal to Richard the Lionheart, and among those were William Marshal. William Marshal was the Earl of Pembroke, the Sheriff of Gloucester, and he was responsible for Bristol Castle, which meant that Bristol Castle becomes a target for John, right? Anything Richard related makes John really angry. So William Marshal, the Bristol Castle manager, if you will, gathers enough men to fend off a siege by John, and Bristol Castle prevails against this siege. Now, John married Isabel of Gloucester as kind of a backdoor way to try and claim Bristol Castle by marriage because it would be her inheritance. Now, unfortunately, the marriage between John and Isabel does turn out to get annulled because they end up being related. John doesn't seem to care. He kind of kidnaps Isabel, and after going on to become king after Richard dies, he seizes Gloucester and effectively seizes Isabel and takes control of Bristol. That tells you a lot about John. You can find out more about him in Shakespeare's play called King John. But fast forward from here then to the War of the Roses and Shakespeare's use of the castle in his play Richard II. Bristol Castle remained important under the Plantagenet kings, the royal family line that ruled England from Henry II all the way through to Richard II, used this castle as a royal stronghold. It was also sometimes a residence and sometimes even a prison. By Richard II's reign, the castle was significant enough to be repaired and prepared for royal visits. Richard II visited Bristol Castle several times, including in 1382 with his queen, Anne of Bohemia, and again in 1391 and 1398. Its most famous moment came in 1399, during the crisis that ended Richard II's reign. While Richard was away in Ireland, Henry Bolingbroke returned from exile to claim his inheritance from the Lancastrian branch of the Plantagenet family. This is the famous War of the Roses clash that you're familiar with here, okay? Richard's supporters fortified Bristol Castle, and they were hoping to hold it as this landing point and stronghold for the king's return. They were saying, we're going to hold out, and when Richard gets back, he's going to at least have us, right? That was their goal. Now, Henry marches to Bristol, surrounds the castle, and offers safety to anyone inside who will abandon Richard's cause. And Henry must have been extremely persuasive because the garrison quickly collapses. Several of Richard's leading counselors, including the Earl of Wiltshire, John Bussey, and Henry Green, were captured at Bristol. They were tried for treason and executed. This turns out to be a major turning point. Henry's actions at Bristol showed that he was no longer merely seeking land, but he was positioning himself to take the throne from Richard II. And you can find out more about how the War of the Roses ended in another episode. But by the time Henry VII visited Bristol in 1486, he doesn't stay at the castle, choosing St. Augustine's Abbey instead for his visit at that time, which shows how far the castle had fallen from this attractive stronghold that, Bolingbroke would want to attack in order to assert his dominance for the throne, all the way down to, Henry VII essentially snubbing it and saying, no, I don't want to stay there. That's not good enough for me. So it shows how far the castle had declined from this important royal fortress for Richard II to, not really much of anything by the late 15th century. Interestingly, at the time that Shakespeare was writing the play Richard II, so this is the mid to late 1590s, it's generally dated to 1595. It wasn't first performed until 1597. At that moment in history, Bristol Castle was in London, but it was a relic. It was in disuse, and it was effectually abused by virtue of neglect. It was just there, but nobody was taking care of it. And Shakespeare obviously studied his history around Richard II because during the context of Richard II and that part of history, the castle was a feature point, a stronghold, and indeed a part of this turning point of this major war. And Shakespeare is true to history in including it that way. You can actually still see the remains of Bristol Castle in London today. I found this picture from 2011. And then I read in 2023 that there was a massive effort underway to give preservation protection to Bristol Castle. I'm hoping that has held and that those projects were accomplished. There was really cool 3D modeling of how the historical structure would have looked. And I'll place links to that story so you can read more about the preservation efforts going on there. If you're in and around London and want to take a historical side trip, it would definitely be worth it to go see Bristol Castle. Can you imagine what all the history those ruins have seen? Ugh, if walls could talk. I'm completing my illustration of Bristol Castle for our May installment of the Castles of Shakespeare series. You can download a free postcard version of Bristol Castle by signing up for our weekly podcast newsletter at cassidycash.com/Bristol. And if you would like a full-size print of the castle, of course, you can find that in my castle shop at cassidycash.com. Oh, I'm also over on Etsy if you're over there. But that's it for this week. I hope that you'll come back for more Castles of Shakespeare history here on YouTube. As I move through all of I'm looking at my list over here. I think I have 23 on my list. I have 23 so far. If you know of ones that I should definitely include, make sure you tell me in the comments. Thank you for being here this week. Thank you for watching. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye. If you like walking around in turn of the 17th century England to see the sights, smell the smells, play the games, and maybe even haunt an old theater or two, then this is the place for you. Hit that notification bell so you can be sure to join us on our next adventure. I'll see you in the next episode.